We now move to our next session. Here we break into two parallel deep dive sector discussions. In Audi 1, right here, we talk about climate tech innovation and sustainable mobility. And in Audi 2, our panelists dive into climate tech innovation in base to value. I request the audience to please feel free to move Audis and attend discussion of your choice. So now, without any further ado, I would like to introduce our panelists who will be discussing climate tech innovations and sustainable mobility here in Audi 1. As I mentioned earlier, we did celebrate the World EV Day yesterday, and today seems to be a good time for this panel discussion. India's rapid urbanization, growing travel demands, and need for energy security has made it very important to make an alternative operational infrastructure and employ greater usage of sustainable mobility vehicles like electric vehicles. Additionally, transitioning to EVs will support the government of India in meeting this commitment of reducing carbon emissions by about 35% until 2030 from 2005 levels. This session will traverse the nuances of electric mobility sector in India and explore the state of the sector. I take immense pleasure in introducing our panelists, and I'll be out of your way. Anand Ganpati Chanira, Chief Operating Officer, Mycelio Fund. Mycelio Fund is India's first seed fund focused solely on clean mobility. They invest in exceptional innovative startups in EV ecosystem, including drivetrain technologies, charging infrastructure, energy management, and special purpose electric vehicles. Akshima Ghate, Principal RMI India. RMI India is an independent not-for-profit organization that works towards accelerating India's transition to a clean, prosperous, and inclusive energy future. Ashwin Mahesh, co-founder Lithium Urban Technologies. They provide an integrated mobility as a service solution to corporate clients, which allows them to have a quick and easy transition to all electric sustainable transport. Sumit Singh, Partner Climate Angels Fund. Climate Angels is an early stage investment syndication platform for pollution reduction and climate tech launched by Go Massive. Finally, we have Vasudha Madhavan, also moderating this session, founder Ostara Advisors. Ostara Advisor is a specialist investment banking firm focused on electric mobility and sustainability, providing fundraising and M&I solutions to companies and investors. Vasudha, over to you.
Thank you so much, Neha. That was a comprehensive introduction to all of the panelists. Hi, everyone in the audience, and it's wonderful that we're getting together this evening to really discuss a topic that is as common as it is important. So let's kind of dive right into it. I'll give you a little bit of an overview, and then we'll get started with specific themes that we have discussed and decided to discuss during the session. So, as you know, we are talking about mobility and energy. I mean, these are sectors that have always been around. We have grown up with it, and this is not a new. None of these are new industries. But what is happening today is there is a fast emerging ecosystem of electric mobility, and this sector really forces policy, forces people, forces countries to do a complete rethink of not just the automotive sector and in fact companies as well, not just the automotive but the energy sector as well, and how that handshake really happens. So there is a complete redesign of energy and mobility that is really happening, or and is speeding up. In the near future, for instance, it's possible that you could be saving the 30 minutes that you spent driving out to the closest petrol pump and fueling your car by actually slow charging your vehicle overnight, and that could actually happen in your basement parking lot if a few things work out well. And if you live in Bangalore, it's possible, or in even Delhi NCR, it's possible that your Amazon delivery came to you in an electric two-wheeler or a three-wheeler, and and very soon, and it's happening in the Western countries, it's possible that you receive over-the-air updates for your electric vehicle software to fix a bug or upgrade your EV or to the next version, so to speak. A quick one there. Tesla a few years ago, and Tesla is known for its over-the-air updates. They shipped an over-the-air update a few years ago, which dramatically changed the distance the car takes to brake and shortened it by 19 feet. And this is a wild idea that your car can actually download some code and become instantly safer. These thoughts are actually possible because of electric mobility and how every component inside the EV is connected. So let's set some context first. India is in the world's fourth largest vehicle market, the world's largest two-wheeler, three-wheeler, and tractor manufacturer. And at a market size of upwards of $180 billion, Indian automotive industry really contributes upwards of 7% of the total GDP. So that's the size of the industry that is getting disrupted today with electric mobility coming in. And how many vehicles have been sold? I'll kind of, as part of the context, let me also share that. In the year ended 2021, Indian consumers bought 238,120 EVs, which was of course down given pandemic and all of that from the previous year where it was close to 300,000, which I'm assuming was the highest it has ever been. Or probably, yeah, I think that's the highest it has ever been. While these numbers are still small compared to the 20 million automobiles we sell every year, the EV trend is unmistakable. 5 years ago, we just sold 22,000 EVs. So this is a very, very large move from 22,000 to 300,000. While there have been temporary pandemic-induced downturns, the industry in India is seeing significant tailwinds from multiple directions, a huge policy push, growing ESG imperatives for corporates and mid-sized businesses, a steep fall in lithium-ion battery prices from 1,200 per kilowatt hour dollar 1,200 to dollar 137, which is actually an 89% fall just the last decade. And much better vehicle availability, more models. We'll get into all of this, in much greater detail. But these are some of the broad trends that are happening, and that is really why it's important for us as passionate, supporters of this movement to really get in here and say what else can startups do, what else can companies do, and what else can other stakeholders do. So with that, let me ask Akshima to set some context for us by talking about India's overall climate goals in terms of reducing emissions, and how significant is mobility in all of that, and why would you say it really matters, and and how do you feel it can actually help in bringing us closer to those goals?
Yeah, thanks, Vasudha. I hope I'm audible.
Yeah.
I think I'll begin first by saying, you talked about disruption, the ICE disruption that is happening. I would rather reframe it and say that there is a transformation happening as far as mobility is concerned. And I think that's where I would say that we have moved, at least as a country, where we were perceiving electrification of transport more as a disruption, to now thinking of it really as a leapfrog opportunity that can transform the way we've been moving. You talked about the overall climate goal and where India is. I think more for everybody's information, and most of us know this, India has set quite ambitious targets as far as its climate goals are concerned. In Paris in 2015, we committed to emission intensity reduction of our GDP by 35% of the 2005 levels. We've set ambitious targets as far as renewables are concerned, as far as a share of non-fossil fuels in electricity capacity generation is concerned. And I think today, when we take stock of it, almost after 5-6 years of Paris Accord, we see that we are pretty much on track in terms of achieving these targets as a nation. But when we particularly look at some of the hard to abate sectors, of which transport is one, industry being the other one, I think there is much to be achieved as far as decarbonization is concerned, and hence the overall contribution to India's climate goals. So there is much more that we have to kind of I would say achieve from transportation sector in terms of decarbonization. Today, if you look overall, we're talking about a contribution of transport to overall emissions in the country to the tune of 15%. Now, that number could look pretty low, but what is happening in this decade itself, we will double our emissions. We are right now at 500 million ton. We'll double it to 1 gigaton by end of this decade, and which is it will be the fastest growing sector in terms of increasing emissions, and that's what is the concern globally. We've all called transport as a hard to abate sector, but I think what has been happening in terms of a lot of innovation solutions being available, right from public transportation, vehicle efficiency improvement, electrification, they have given us the confidence that it is possible to maintain transport emissions at 20 levels itself, and electrification per se would play a very, very critical role in terms of containing those emissions. Yeah, back to you, Vasudha.
Yeah, thanks, Akshima. I think 15 growing to 30% is a huge jump, and it's going to happen sooner than we expect. And of course, we have to think about the entire value chain of when we even talk about electric mobility, in terms of saying that the source of the energy has to be clean, etc. Given that this has been the case, and I'm going to now talk a little bit about Norway, which has actually set the example in terms of electrification. What do you think worked there in getting such high levels of electrification happen? Recent reports that I read said that 50% of all new vehicles sold in Norway are EVs, and then they're very, very quickly sort of marching towards getting there. So, what do you think worked, and how could we learn from that?
Yeah, I think to begin with, in Norway, there has been a very, very supportive policy framework which brought in a lot of incentives that help achieve upfront cost parity of EVs. So that's one big thing there. They transitioned to an extensive network of charging infrastructure that supported that electrification, and slowly it was more like attention toward market, where we saw a lot of choices to the consumers. So over years, what we've seen in market is a strong policy framework supported by infrastructure, availability of models for consumers, and more awareness generation. On top of it, has also been commitment at the national, at the regional level towards clean mobility. All of that falling in place, to encourage that. If we look back at India, I think we still far away from where Norway is today. We've been seeing increasing EV sales, more than ever before, as of now. And to me, if you're just looking at the context of Norway and overall what's happening globally, I think few things have already started happening in India, and the most important one being the first lever, I would say, or the driver, is the policies. We've had the central government policies in place since almost 2015. And now in the last 1 year, what we've seen is like an increasing number of states. So that same thing, regional policies now happening even in India. They've been providing heavy incentives. Just 1 year back, we just had central government incentives. Now you're topping them up with regional government or state government incentives, which are playing a huge, huge role in terms of bringing down costs of EVs. We're also seeing an increasing model availability in our market. Just in a year, we've doubled the number of car models. We have close to 10 car models, electric car models today, close to 20 variants. Same thing with two-wheelers, almost 1.5 years when I was looking at, what's the market scenario as far as models availability is concerned, there were about, say, 15 models. Today, we are talking about 40 models. And interestingly, a lot of this is happening in the high performance premium segment. We never had, Benedict Cumberbatch advertising so many times on our televisions before. So a lot happening as far as, market creation side as well, and from the industry side as well. Yeah.
A little bit also, while before we close that section out, in terms of what do you think from a manufacturer and the incumbent perspective, right, that we could do differently, or what have we done just to kind of get that part of it also moving in the direction of
Uh, Given the space that I come from, I always think like a policy researcher. I think rather than industry doing something, definitely, they have to come out, they have to make investments, they have to come out with more models. But when I think from, a policy researcher hat, I feel that industry will also perhaps need to be pushed through things like ZEF credit mandates, so that they are pushed in a particular timeline to bring out models, better models in the market for the consumers, which perhaps they're already providing in other parts of the world. So for industry, it's definitely more about R&D, bringing models, and I think they need to be now nudged by the government as well. So far, the focus of the government policies has been on demand creation and focusing on consumers. I think now the focus needs to be on supply side, the manufacturers, to push them.
Yeah, thanks for that. I'll move to the next question, and we'll go to Anand and then to Ashwin. So if you take an ecosystem-wide view of where electric mobility is today, and there are multiple priorities, right? I mean, what do you want to focus on? If you're a business in the space, you could look at essentially the source of it, which is at the energy generation level, and how could you make that more sustainable, to technology elements, etc. And of course, moving into the energy as a service or the battery swapping, charging, creating new vehicle models, localizing of the supply chain, etc. So there are so many aspects to making this kind of happen. So just at a very broad level, or you can pick one specific subsector or area where you feel this is the best example. But how important do you think ground up innovation is, specifically coming up with India specific solutions in any of these subsectors? If you can give me a subsector that you think where it works best, and whether it's innovation, or are we best at taking something that has been tried and tested and maybe mass manufacturing it here, or scaling it up here.
Thanks. Thank you, Vasudha. It's interesting because when I think of this sector, I don't think of 20 million vehicles. Right? I think of it as different segments. 80% being two-wheelers. In those two-wheelers, which ones for commuters versus cargo, for example. And even if we speak, for example, of high-end cars, I think it's just 1.5% or less, which are greater than 15 lakhs, which lends itself to something like this. So with that context, and I'm using data from the fund that we have, but we also have last mile companies as well as an OEM part of us, right? And over the last 2 years, spoken to more than 400, 500 EV startups in India. So the context to my answer is having spoken to 400 to 500 EV startups in India and actually being part of that ecosystem.
That's as many as they are, isn't it?
It is interesting because 400, 500 are we have something called a studio where there are 1,200 community members. So I think it's extremely interesting, right? To your point about innovation, I think each of the different segments, if I look at large OEMs who are actively doing, so in my head, there are 4 large segments. There are large OEMs, the ICE players who are actively doing something here. Second, large OEMs who are kind of on the periphery. That's number 2. Number 3 is these startups which have gotten big, right? I mean, the Aethers and Olas are prime examples. And number 4 is startups which are innovating across, whether you take battery, whether you take motors, and we'll talk through that. I think in each of these 4, there is different kind of innovation happening, and all 4 must coexist. It's very easy to say in startups, there are new companies that are doing like energy from water and aluminum. There is a company that is doing that. Or there is an innovative model for switched reluctance motors. It sounds very cool and exciting, but to get that commercialization takes time. Okay, so that must exist as it is and follow a path. At the same time, if I look at large startup OEMs like an Aether or Ola, the sense of scale that they bring in suddenly brings about a supply chain innovation where existing suppliers to ICE OEMs can very quickly change certain things and become EV suppliers. That suddenly lends itself to the Make in India and other spaces there, which they cannot do if they were just startups OEMs because they don't have that sense of scale. Or the business models which might take models, let's say hypothetically from a Taiwan or a China, and change that for the Indian context and then build that scale. It's completely different innovation. So across the last 3 years, I've seen innovation in all of these three. You said pick a subsector and go deep into that. No, I've actually, across the ecosystem, we've seen various plays. And I think all of them are important because if the ecosystem doesn't develop as a whole, we might win in the short term, but that's not sustainable.
Yeah.
Right? And I think if you think about it this way, there's play for any investor to put it either in innovation in seed or in growth capital.
So different kinds of innovation. Yeah, no, that's very interesting. Yes. Yeah, that's interesting to see, is to perceive innovation in different ways and not have one single way of viewing it. Thanks, Anand. Over to you, Ashwin. If you can share your thoughts on where and how do you perceive innovation in India specifically? You know, some would say that we've never been deep tech, or we've never been top of the world in terms of some of those, but innovation has been more service based, or other end user models that tend to be our strengths. So where would you say the role of innovation comes in within this area?
I don't think we have a choice like that we sort of tend to turn around and call something our strength, because that's all we can really do. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. There's a science side to electric vehicles and a technology side to electric vehicles, and then there's a service side. We're nowhere in the science side, right? So that by the time the technology comes around, you're only a follower already. You're doing what other people have already done. So there is that problem. And then the services are constrained by various other things as well. Just going back to just 2-3 points that we covered so far, I think that we're still substantially not led by policy at all. I don't think policy has contributed more than 10 or 15% to anything that has happened in the sector so far. If anything, the policies are still quite restrictive. Although they are presented as enabling, they're fairly restrictive. The single biggest obstacle, everybody knows this, the single biggest obstacle is vehicle availability, right? And the problem is that we tend to profess a policy priority in a very strange way. Quite often, and this is quite common in politics, but it's particularly common in the way we've gone about it in certain sectors. When you say that my policy is pro something, you actually have to say that it's also anti something. That merely to say that something is pro something is not sufficient in some way. And then there's conflict, right? So for example, you take Make in India. Make in India is clearly slowing down the availability of vehicles in India. Because if you did not have Make in India, you would get a lot more vehicles. I'm quite certain of that. And then at a policy perspective, nobody has ever asked the question, should Make in India be preceded by Sell in India? Make in India is a policy that has existed since 1947. Right? They just called it different things. Nehru's policy was Make in India too. Indira Gandhi's policy was Make in India too. Even the RSS had Swadeshi. So in a sense, I don't think Make in India itself is new. That if we don't go to the actual bottlenecks and say, look, availability of vehicles is the key bottleneck. When do we think there will be mass adoption? When prices come down. When will prices come down? When there is volume. When will there be volume? When there is mass buying. So you're going around in circles telling yourself these things. So broadly, I don't think that we can get away from that problem. The state is not really helping except in these accounting terms, right?
I think you're absolutely right in the fact that you mentioned that for every, when you enunciate, articulate what you're for, you should also policy wise articulate what you're against, and which is where Akshima mentioned the point around disincentives which work better for manufacturers in some sense, or so different parties could respond differently, helping the ecosystem grow. But I think on vehicle models again, this is just the beginning, but we probably get into that point a little later as well when we talk about shared mobility and a few other topics.
But there's a connection.
Yeah.
Let me finish what I'm saying. There's a connection to India's industrial policy. The industrial policy, by and large, favors innovation by existing players. This is, you can call it collusion, you can call it a nexus between business and government. Lots of people call it various things. The general assumption is that an existing vehicle manufacturer will produce the innovations in the next set of vehicles, an existing energy producer, blah, blah, blah. Now, this actually is an impediment to real innovation. But it works well for the existing manufacturers because it protects their market. In some way, we've set up the whole policy ecosystem in a way that looks to existing large players in every sector to be the innovators in that sector. But these are the guys who would lose the most if that innovation actually happened. So they're going to do it at the pace that is most comfortable for them, or not do it even in some cases. So I think the policy environment is actually sort of messed up quite badly because it doesn't think through. There's a lot of error in one particular way. Policies also have to be two-step. So when you announce something, people will do something. And if it's not exactly what you think they will do, you must have a second step that follows on that policy. Invariably, we don't actually have that. We'll announce an urbanization policy, we'll announce chemical manufacturing policy or something like that. We'll announce some policy. And then industry will behave completely unexpectedly, somewhat predictably, but also unexpectedly to the policy. And then nobody will go back and say, this policy isn't actually working the way we thought it is. Now we have to tweak it. It'll go 15 years before that sort of thing happens. So my concern is that we are in a situation where only ad hoc, lightweight, doable technology is driving innovation. So your rickshaw wala who can cable together a bunch of wires and a battery and a wheel, that's going on. Slightly better manufacturing, not so regulated, the amperes of the world, that's going on as well. And some
three-wheelers also there is innovation, four-wheelers also there is. So I think
those are basically easy to cobble together. But I'm saying you're not going to, the real momentum is going to come from four-wheel manufacturing happening in scale. And that really requires a very different orientation.
Right. Thank you, Ashwin. I would like to go over to Sumit and ask him what he thinks about Sumit, what do you feel about where innovation should come from, and what has been your observation really looking at the landscape?
Very, very interestingly, it's absolutely contrarian to what Ashwin sir has said. We looked at mobility at Climate Angels for about 2 years now. We've looked at what all is happening in the ecosystem, multiple markets. And what we zeroed in was that we created a new vehicle category. It's called slow moving, low speed. Indian cities are not designed like US cities or European cities, or the infrastructure is not like that, which is going to move at a high pace. Why do we need to design a powertrain for that high speed? Indian cities, we do not have warehousing in the middle of the city. You go to a San Jose, your warehouse of San Jose is right adjacent to San Jose. You come to any suburb of Delhi or Bangalore or Mumbai, you're not going to find a warehouse in Colaba, right? You're not going to find a warehouse in Worli. It's on the outskirts, and then it gets moved by these low weight, slow moving vehicles into the city. Our urban mobility is just designed completely differently, and our solutions need to be designed completely differently. We love the revolution that e-rickshaws have brought about. It grew like a weed in North India. The reason was Ambala which is a perfect water divide between the Indus and Gangetic plain, is 300 meters above sea level. Calcutta, 2,000 kilometers away, 1,700 odd kilometers away, is 10 meters above sea level. There is no gradient, which is why this vehicle succeeded. It is not going to succeed around the Western Ghats and the Eastern Ghats. You don't, so but it just grew like weed in this area. Similarly, it might be a lot of regional. We don't need to design for motors which are suited for, let's say, driving through the Alps. We need to design for motors which are suitable for normal Indian cities, and I think that's where the huge opportunity is. So yeah, going back, the category we defined it was slow moving, low speed. Let's back anything that is innovative, anything that can be scaled at a large level, and we're looking at a lot of offshoots. Having said that, if there are new lithium technologies, new battery tech, I'm sure Anand has looked at them also. New ways of designing a battery. We're more than we're looking at those opportunities also. But anything that really energizes the slow moving, low speed vehicle, that's where we are banking.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in my experience as well, having worked with a few OEMs, I was actually part of, doing the Ampere deal, and then also I worked with a few other companies later. So having known OEMs, I think innovation has to be definitely very, very India specific, and it cannot be a copy paste. Let's kind of now start to break things down a little bit, and since we are talking about India specific users and India specific conditions, what we have seen in electric mobility in the last few years, and the use cases have really started to come up, bubble up in a very, very significant manner. Personal mobility is of course one where two-wheelers are leading the way, and to what Ashwin earlier said, as well as the incumbents, more than the incumbents, it's been the startups really leading the way across the board in the EV ecosystem, right? So one of the use cases has definitely been personal mobility, and then we have shared mobility both on the personal or last mile logistics or last mile transportation, as well as public transportation sort of. So we are talking about moving people. And the other key use case has been logistics. And this has really had a very, very huge both a growth tailwind because of COVID and resultant increase in e-commerce, etc. But also that there has been a very, very strong commercial argument, economic argument for it. And we want to just break these things down. We start with talking a little bit about shared personal mobility. And I'll go to Ashwin with this, and then we move to the next section. But on what do you feel? How have you, in your experience, seen personal mobility or shared personal mobility really take off, and where do you feel what are the critical enablers for this space? And I'm of course referring to fleets and similar B2C and B2B solutions, as well as public transportation.
I think there are 2-3 things, right? One is that we don't have concentration of employment in the ways that many large cities around the world do. And part of the reason is that we accept building plan applications from anybody from anywhere. But this is again another policy example of the type that I said. You say, I want to create 100,000 houses, but you won't say where you want to create the 100,000 houses. You'll continue to accept applications for construction even from water scarce areas, because somebody owns land, he wants to build a house. You look only at the technical specifications. So because you don't have concentrations of employment, you will not get everywhere enough numbers of people moving in directions that are easily shareable. That's one part of it. You could drive this from the public transportation side by building a direction-oriented public transport network. And metros are helping with that, because metro by definition is direction-oriented. One mistake we made with metros everywhere is that we tend to build the metro along the road. In a sense, it doesn't really add new directional possibilities. But by and large, it can bring direction orientation. Many public transport systems have finally come to the realization that they have to get rid of destination orientation and move to direction orientation. And that will drive transit oriented development even if we don't consider all of these things really as policy in our development authorities. If you go to a BDA or a DDA, there are not that many people talking about these sorts of things. But the inevitability of making some macro choices that are transit oriented will drive some of these other things. We also need to look at sustainable mobility and shared mobility together. We like shared because it is sustainable, but we haven't actually made a commitment to sustainable itself so far. We think sort of shared is good because it's sustainable, but who has come out and said, I favor sustainable? All the guys who are telling you that EV is good have done very little for pedestrianization, have done very little for improving public bus fleets, right? The global norm for bus fleets is about 1,200 buses per, let's say, a million of population. So a typical city like a city like Bangalore should have 15,000 buses. We have only 6,500. If you're really committed to sustainability, the first thing I would do is I would double the bus fleet. If you're really committed to sustainability, I would say, well, you build some 4 or 5 walkable streets, right? Build 400. Because then what happens? Some things that are doable, the short runs that are doable by walk, you wouldn't be taking away a vehicle at all. So you can't think of greening the vehicle as your only approach to sustainability. But if you are in favor of sustainability, there's a set of things that you have to do that looks at non-motorized transport in particular with sufficient budgetary support. We have a thumb rule in all our governments, right? We'll say for a cycle track, I'll spend 10 crores. For a road, I'll spend maybe, 50 crores or 100 crores. For buses, I'm not going to give that much money, more than that, 200 crores maybe. For a metro, I'll spend. So essentially, nobody asked the question, why don't we spend 1,000 crores on pedestrianization? Because if you spend 1,000 crores on pedestrianization, you would eliminate a lot of vehicular movement for local movement. So if you sort of invert the way you think about it, you can do this a lot faster. The real block now is that we're trying to move shared mobility towards sustainability without a prior commitment to sustainability itself. That said, I think it's this kind of local innovation among people. For a while, there was this wave of software-driven things where people would say, oh, you're going from here to here, let me see if I can find you a partner dynamically. There's some of that. Uber does that by pooling. Ola does that by pooling. There's a lot of those kinds of things that are possible. This actually goes back. I actually listened to what Sumit said, so there's no contradiction at all. The only things that are happening are the things that people can do themselves without policy support, without even much capital support. Frankly, most of the innovation that's happened has happened without capital support, and that's important for a group like this to take.
I hope this conclave changes that. That's definitely something we've seen, is that capital flow into sustainable mobility is just starting to happen. We just hope that.
Yeah, Shyam Menon said in the previous section that he'd like to see asset managers in India put money into this thing. I think capital support is weak, and that has to change. So I think shared, the people are ready for shared. The supply is poor, the policy is poor, but the people are ready. So this is the irony of the whole environment, that we're actually holding back a transition that could happen much faster because the policy environment is set to favor the status quo. And the manufacturers who dominate the status quo also, they don't want this changing fast enough. So only things that are possible outside of that constraint are happening.
Got it. Yeah, I would now go over to Anand to kind of get an investor perspective, and then quickly to Sumit as well. In the personal shared mobility, last mile transportation for people, and we've seen a few things happening here in two-wheeler, three-wheeler. There are people coming up with business models, even around metro stations, or there are so many interesting sort of startups thinking of new areas here. So where do you feel, what do you think we can do differently, or how can we increase capital flow? I think that has really been the challenge. We cannot, if we meet couple of years from now, hopefully there'll be more to that list of Ola and Ather in terms of people that have managed to attract capital and scale, and those stories. What do you think can be done? Anand and then Sumit.
Well, listening to Yeah, while listening to both Ashwin and Sumit, right? I remember the team at 8 Steps saying, you can scale what works, but it must work at scale. And I think that is a fundamental difference. Ashwin's thinking about what works at scale, and fundamentally, that's what policy helps. And from an investment perspective, you will try and sometimes scale what already works. Right? So when Sumit spoke about the gradient across two things, or when you see the petrol price didn't increase overnight to 100 rupees. Gas prices, Jan 2020 was very different. Yes, the economics work out now. So if I think of where money is going in today, or if I think at a later stage, you asked about personal mobility versus, let's say, even cargo logistics, any place where it makes economic sense, money is followed it. I can talk about numerous investments that we have seen in this group. I'm sure in the audience there are either who have co-invested with us or we're going to do it with them, both for last mile personal mobility and more interestingly for last mile cargo, because even 3 years ago, last mile cargo lent itself economically to, unit economics worked straight away. If you did 60, 70 kilometers on an electric vehicle, last mile cargo automatically worked. Today, with the gas prices, it will work even at 30, which is why personal mobility will work. Shared is a little different, where when Ashwin said, I can create a platform for just getting people together.
Yeah.
So two key things. One, all the models that are there, from investors' perspective, we're looking at models which perhaps can scale. To Ashwin's point about whether policy can figure out what can work at scale, I think as investors, we are happy to do this as well as go bottom up, top down. I have found no contradiction in that sense. Only point is, can you take 10 of these and figure out if policy changes, will they grow in a different way? It'll work. I don't know if I'm answering your question directly, Vasudha, but fundamentally, there are enough opportunities in the 500, 600, very good EV plays. I'm not too concerned about the science part that Ashwin spoke about because there's a technology play and the business play. On both the technology and business, there are wonderful opportunities, whether it is debt versus other kind of capital. Yes, that must be made much, much stronger. But that apart, there are enough opportunities right now in India.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And Sumit, what do you think in terms of the shared mobility piece?
How we look at it is that there is pure tech play and then there are business models play. Okay. Personally, and even at Climate Angels, we feel that right now the tech stack itself is not solved for. So that is where one should be focusing more energies on innovating for India and solutions that are applicable in India completely, even if they're linked to public transport or wherever they're headed. But that play is completely, open. So so if it's about existing car fleets or cargo fleets that have to be electrified, that can be done by debt because these are strong balance sheets already. So these can be leveraged and debt can be deployed there. I think that's more a play for debt. For early stage investors and higher risk capital, I think it's the time. The market is right there. It's sitting right in front of us. It's not that the market is not there. It's time to look at these innovative solutions and probably push down there. That's how I would, it's very important. The use case is very important. I completely get that. But we are focusing more on the tech aspect or what is going to be bringing the inflection point such that the use case gets even more energized.
Sort of an enabler for the use case, I'm guessing. That's where you feel. From a technology aspect, which could enable fleets or which could enable shared mobility to operate better and seamlessly.
like existing car fleets owners, or even if they're taxi services or whatever, they a lot of people have 8, 9 vehicles and are deployed or whatever. The small players like that, they're larger fleet owners also which are in play. For them to convert to electrification, yes, technology also has to come in, but it's easier for them to leverage their balance sheet if debt is available.
Right.
Equity there is probably needs to go more towards technology building for India.
Right.
That's our focus.
Sure. Just spending a moment on this shared personal mobility piece, taxi fleets, and all of that is that what I'm learning is that there are challenges even because of enabling infrastructure, etc., not being there. That itself makes it difficult for adoption to happen. And maybe at this point, I want to get in Akshima for a quick one to say what do you feel can, from a policy perspective, can actually happen, or what do you feel is a quick enabling point for, fleets or car driver owners, or people who are in the business of last mile mobility to become to electrify quickly, because the enabling infrastructure does come in the way. And that's, do you perceive any other challenges, and how do you think some of those could be overcome to make some of these businesses scale quicker?
Yeah, thanks, Asta. So I think just picking up what you said on electrifying quickly and how that can happen, and in particular referring to fleets, I'm just looking at some of the geographies around the world which are a little way ahead. In fact, not little, perhaps way ahead than us. And say, just to pick a case in point for Shenzhen. And why Shenzhen? Because the last mile electric delivery vehicles in the city were to the tune of 400 in 2015 and 40,000 in 2018. And now they're close to 1 lakh. So in just a matter of 4 or 5 years, I moved from 400 to almost 1 lakh electric last mile delivery vehicles, which is nearly 50% of my last mile delivery fleet of the city.
And these are autonomous, or these are manned vehicles?
Manned vehicles. And I think and when we say that how we can electrify quickly, I'm just looking at some of these examples and just figuring out what's happening.
Yeah.
Subsidies have been in place, but one big thing is that they'll not be there forever. And one big learning is that there are things that have to happen beyond subsidies. There are things that have to happen, beyond the current frameworks, and that's where, actually now the role of policy innovation also comes. We've talked about business innovation, technology innovation, even policy innovation will become very critical. That policies will have to evolve as logistics electrifications is progressing. Today, what is our focus is that we say that okay, logistics is a low hanging fruit, and Anand just talked about the unit price being so well. It is a low hanging fruit, so we must be incentivizing or supporting this segment, fleet segment, to electrify. But so far what we've done is we've placed almost the whole ecosystem is like placing vehicle in hand of a driver. That's where we are today. But I think we will have to kind of move beyond that. That's one step, but that's really not the only step. We will have to ensure that once we have the vehicles on road, how do we now displace the fossil fuel vehicles? And that's where we've seen a city like Shenzhen coming out with so many other non-fiscal measures. And that's where I bring the part of policy innovation, whether it is in terms of access, whether it is in terms of parking, whether it is in terms of being super flexible in terms of how charging was allowed at warehousing facilities where deliveries were being made. And there has been more like a partnership which has given between business community and public. So I think that will have to happen. We are right now at hundreds and thousands. That's what we are talking about. We have to really move to lakhs and millions. A lot of these partnerships, innovations would have to happen at regional scales. That would give us the kind of scale that we're looking at.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, absolutely. I think, like Ashwin also said, if something doesn't work, think of something else and respond quickly as a policymaker as well. I think that's critical. And, also one of the key
things.
things.
Add to that?
Yeah, sure.
I second what Akshima said, because aside from investing, we also run a last mile logistics company. Okay. and it's a pure play EV fleet, will be more than 2,000, 3,000. And when I look at different states and the non-fiscal policies, she spoke about parking. She spoke about access to central business district within certain windows, perhaps only for EV, right? And the Shenzhen example of going from 400 to 100,000. I can easily see that happening, even if I just pick our top 10 cities. And which is why I always go back to, I don't want to think of boiling the ocean. Pick up the segment, forget that it's a low hanging fruit. Forget that logistics is a low hanging fruit. But even if I just picked that, right, out of the 250,000 EVs that we sold, 95% will be two wheelers. And out of that, 80% will be slow moving. But all plus minus, okay, if I remove the e-rickshaws there, even these non-fiscal measures can have a scale of 10x in 2 years. Nothing goes out from a policy, fiscal policy perspective, but 10x in 2 years, because already you have all the consumers, if I think of the Amazons, Big Baskets, IKEAs of the world, who want to electrify their fleets, who said certain things. Fleet operators are absolutely geared to do this. Consumers, okay, have no play, they are supportive. But the moment these kind of things, because the economics is already working. The economics is already working. You can go 10x in 2 years with just this. Investments will automatically follow. Equity or debt is secondary. Because I've seen fleets grow from buying it to leasing it. Aggregation for electric is a little ways away because individuals have not yet bought. Right, you can't do a Swiggy model with electric because there aren't enough electric to.
But that would mean the real change, right? To your point about Amazons and Big Baskets, they are still the the creamy layer of logistics consumption, EV consumption. You need to actually go, you need to actually go to the last dealer-led selling and making, where also TCO works, by the way.
Oh, absolutely.
The TCO argument works, but then there are other things, like some of the things that Akshima mentioned on making it easy to be used, make the individual guy invest in one. Yeah, Ashwin, you wanted to say some. Thanks, Anand.
So let's separate businesses from the ecosystem and ask the question.
Yeah.
There are about six, maybe more than six things, at least six things, right? Vehicle design and development.
Yeah.
Vehicle production, vehicle financing.
Yeah.
Vehicle operations, the technology for whatever optimization and value extraction, energy management, and end of life management. There are at least these 7 things that need to be done. Now, and these are at different scales, 2-wheeler, 3-wheeler, high wattage, low wattage, all sorts of things. Right? So now you've got a situation in which all of these things as an ecosystem can provide a powerful alternative to what we already have. But in this ecosystem, only 2 of the 7 pieces are more or less likely to be profitable. 2 or 3 are never going to be profitable, and 1 or 2 will tread water. Now, the problem is that unless the ecosystem exists, the profitable businesses also can't run fast. But most investment tends to look at the businesses in isolation, independent of the ecosystem. So the question is, and that's the trouble now, that you can't really drive this thing fast because you need all the, for example, charging infrastructure. Everybody and his brother is now setting up charging infrastructure all over the place. They're never going to make any money with charging infrastructure. In 5 years, the price of energy will be zero, right? Or close to it. It will be irrelevant. And why would you leave your? There's also the urbanization problem, which somebody referred to, right? We never anticipated a scenario in which a lower income group person, a lower middle class person, would have a car as his tool, right? So you and I can charge quietly in slow charge at home. But if you're a driver of a taxi, where are you going to slow charge quietly at home? And if you live in a house with 3 other people that are sharing that house?
No, vehicles could have higher range, and that could solve for that because our intra-city driving range is not that much also. Right?
No, I'm not denying that. And that will also be true. In 5 years, you'll have a vehicle that can go 1,000 kilometers without too much.
Doesn't need that also.
And it'll charge in 15 minutes. If the 1,000 kilometer range vehicle will also charge in 15 minutes. So that's not going to be the obstacle. All the things that will happen through science, typically outside of India, through low-cost innovation within existing frameworks within India, all of that is surely going to happen. Right. Nobody doubts that. But whether that thing is going to help you catch up to the kinds of numbers and percentages that we are seeing in front-running countries, that's the question. And I think for the moment, that is not even within reach, that you have to do something very different to play at that level. Can we go in 10x? Yes, because the base is so low, number one, and the demand is so high. So of course you can go to, in India, you can go 1000x also over time, because the numbers are there. But whether you can do that, the second convergence is also important. Your competition can come from the oil industry. It can come from the other kinds of energy players. It can come from the building industry. It can come from the e-commerce industry. It can come from all the convergence that are happening. Today, we see the convergence of mobility and energy. Energy and buildings are already converged. In 10 years, you will see that there is no distinction. The energy built form mobility is just one consolidated urban industry. And at that point, you will have all sorts of people making investments using anchor starting points that they have established in one or more of these spaces. So unless you have investments and businesses that accept some responsibility for growing the ecosystem while they grow their businesses, they're not going to have the enabling outside world out of which the business momentum can grow. So, this is one of the things that we sort of did early on at Lithium, right? We ran the E2O, which wasn't even a shared mobility car, right? People were like, they're thinking, Chetan and I remember talking about this the first time, and we said, how, I'll give you two examples, which are really worth it. Until the time we ran the E2O in shared mobility, that car had never been financed by anybody. All the people that bought that car until that point had bought it outright. And for many of them, it was their second or the third car. Right? So it wasn't it was sustainable, but actually they were using it so little that it wasn't actually the environment cost of producing it wasn't even being offset by how much they used it. So it was at that level. Now the question was, would anybody use this car in a shared mobility space? But that's where you have early believers, people like Tesco who came to us and said, look, of course this is the wrong car, but let's get started. But that's the point, right? Innovation happens because it's in the future. Right? It happens in the present because it's in the future, and people accept that it's not in the present, and that's why we should do it. And I think that's the part that we have to get past. Once we do that, it's a lot easier to do. We also, the banks were unwilling to finance the cars. The first few cars that we bought fully with our own money, because the banks would say, well, we don't know what the resale value is. Right? Of course, even I don't know what the resale value is. But the banks are unable to distinguish between uncertainty and risk in emerging markets. So they equate all uncertainty with risk. So I don't know what the resale value of the car will be, therefore it's zero. Right? I mean, nobody ever says, I don't know what the resale value will be, therefore it's $1 million.
No, financing is a very, very important point. I mean,
nobody knows the performance of the battery. When Mahindra sold the vehicle to us, they said this battery will last 120,000 kilometers. After we had run it 200,000 kilometers, Mahesh Babu came to me and said, can I buy the car back from you? I want to demonstrate to my people, to our buyers, that this car can go 200,000 kilometers. But it can go 200,000 kilometers because we managed it well. We tracked every single thing in that car. Your average user is not going to do that. So what I'm trying to say is that this is an ecosystem that is emerging. That even businesses that want to make money must accept some responsibility for the broader ecosystem. And that broader ecosystem, and accept that in that broader ecosystem, not everybody can make money. So you have to carry that along. It's like going on a trip as a family, right? And I give this analogy a lot. I tell people, when you go on a holiday with your spouse and children, who carries the heavy bag? You don't go and tell your 3-year-old son, well, it's each man for himself. You have to pull your weight, now carry your own bags, right? And that's what makes you a family. So ecosystems are like families in some ways, that if you want to travel together as an ecosystem, you have to carry the bags of those who can't do that part profitably. Right? And that's really what we're struggling with. We're still expecting businesses to be profitable in silos, even though their profit depends on unprofitable other pieces of the ecosystem.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I know this from business models in fleet. I know this from business models in batteries, and in multiple, that it is EV, electric mobility is definitely an ecosystem approach, whether for the business or for the investor or for the policy stakeholders, etc. And this is how it is, and not everything will be profitable. But the point is, can one make it scale to the point where it becomes investable, it becomes scalable, it becomes a larger story to kind of harness the consumption opportunity that India provides, right? I think that's what investors would be essentially looking for, and how can the specific business model actually achieve that, despite or with because of some of the things. Let me kind of take up a couple of. I think we are in the last 15 minutes of our session, so I want to cover a couple of topics. We also have some audience questions coming in. Let me quickly take views, and maybe from Akshima, around energy as a service ecosystem, and and battery standardization. I know these are all large topics, and we could probably spend an hour or more talking just on that. But this is something, India opening up sale of vehicles without the battery, I think was a game changing and a very, very positive kind of a step, because it reduces the cost of the vehicle, upfront cost of the vehicle, and you can lean into a swapping network to kind of run the vehicle and operate it at a lower cost. So what's your kind of take? And we've heard some recent news about motorcycle manufacturers coming together and building a consortium of, batteries are uniform, so anywhere you go, you can, any of the competing manufacturers can actually, have similar batteries. So where do you feel, and what's your sort of take on where this could go for India, and what's the right approach here?
I think I take the analogy from Ashwin about innovation and seeing it in future. I think in future, if we see, perhaps there is an opportunity, a significant opportunity that battery swapping has. There would be a scale to it, but today what we are seeing, and in fact, this is not. I think there are players which have been trying this for the last 1 or 2 years or a little more. Today, it's really a pure B2B kind of a model, and which has definitely led to, and it's primarily because of lack of battery standardization, because there are OEM battery operator kind of partnerships. So it is right now restricted very much to my partnership with a particular player. It has definitely limited the number of vehicle models that can be really be using or swapping batteries at battery stations, and hence the market we see is very, very nascent at a very initial stage. And if you were to compare it with something like ICE vehicle, I can freely go to any petrol pump today and fill my petrol. So that standardization, I think, if we draw that analogy from where ICE vehicles are today, it can be refueled anywhere. And that's where battery standardization will be critical if we are to promote.
Is that possible? Do you see that happening?
I think I'll let industry answer that question, because it's more about industry players agreeing and coming together on board.
Could I take that?
Absolutely.
Right, and I'm going to now where the industry. Yeah, I'm going to where the industry had in a sense, right? And Ashwin would also agree. In the end, if you were an investor and think of a large fleet, right? Even 2 years ago, I've told you we run a fleet. When they did not let the batteries be sold separately, what we did was we bought the vehicle and we removed the batteries and standardized the batteries. Right? And you're just going to make that thing happen for you. You're going to figure out the economics, going to make it scale, because then your clients are going to give you space to charge. You can think of the GoGrow model, which started with a standardized battery, and they built vehicles around themselves. Now they're partnering with other OEMs to use the GoGrow batteries. It is I'm not saying policy or industry has to follow each other, but anywhere, yes, in that use case, it's a smaller area, you can do things differently. But which is why I'm not going to think of scaling this right across India, because it is too very large. But if you take 10 cities, and the reason I always pick last mile, commuter or cargo, is easy to do it because you have X number of space. And I'm picking predominantly 2-wheelers and 3-wheelers because they lend themselves to swappable more than a 4-wheeler. It is already being done. It is already working. And I'm sure many investors, including us, are already investing in these kind of options, tech or business led, right? So my point is that part is already happening. The scale will happen even if there are non-fiscal policy measures. But if you expect the government to come in and standardize and say, okay, this is it,
that ain't gonna happen. I don't think it will work because industries. I mean, battery design is also critical to the way the vehicle has been envisioned and performance and all of that, right? So
it might happen over time. The industry itself, it's pretty much like your phone charging, right? I mean, everybody will agree with these examples. By default, after some time, industry will decide what the standardization norms are.
Yeah.
It's easier to do the long range vehicles because, but they tend to be more expensive, but it's actually easier despite the expense. You could go Chennai, Bangalore once a day, back and forth, and do 700 kilometers today, cheaper than you can do it on a Verito, a regular Verito. Right? You would make more money doing it if you then, because that's the unit economics, that if you run 550 kilometers a day, your total cost on the electric vehicle, even with an MG, you could do this with an MG, and you would still make more money than if you did it with a diesel Verito. And that seems like really bizarre, but we tell people, right? You want to go to Chennai from Bangalore, we'll take you on an MG for the price of going in a Verito. And that's the advantage, right? Because the running cost of the EV is so low. What is the real value? You don't sell electric. If you sell electric, nobody's going to buy it. Partly because everybody likes to come up, cut a ribbon on day one, on the launch day and say we're going green. But the procurement manager is not thinking green. The procurement manager is thinking, kitna bachega, right? That's really what he's sort of working with. And he is accountable for that in his organization. So you can't sell electric. You have to sell productivity. You have to sell value. The minute you get to market competitiveness and sell that, right? Everything else sort of falls by the wayside. And that's why I say, for me as an operator, I have only one complaint. Vehicle availability is low.
That you need more models in the market to be available.
No, I should be allowed to get the models that exist wherever they are. If the goal is for India to go green, why would you say that I'm not going to allow really green vehicles to come into India? And then you will say, oh, but we want to become a manufacturer of these vehicles over time. To which my response is, the only things that have ever picked up mass manufacturing in India are the things that were first allowed to be sold in India. Look at the example of computers and look at the example of cell phones and all of these things. Yes, it's still low end, but once you could sell them all over India, the manufacturers started to figure out that certain things are better off being made in India because the logistics costs are that much better. So in my judgments, if we can drive cell in India, make in India will not be necessary at all.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think, EV presents an opportunity for disruption or transformation, as Akshima called it, in multiple ways. And one of them could actually be to say that maybe the startups can actually reimagine the way vehicles have been made, and we can actually create them here and scale them up. And of course, with a mix of getting them in, because there's a lot of research happening globally in vehicle platforms and all of that. So we could benefit from that in multiple ways. But obviously, policy is always a tightrope walk between multiple priorities. So not a single priority will always win, right? So, I would probably we have a couple of minutes. So closing comments from everyone, on what could give from here. If you say we are in September of 2021, in the next 1 year, or in next 1.5, end of next year, what could be the one thing that could give the biggest boost to electric mobility consumption and EV adoption? Starting with you, Akshima.
Oh, I was going to pose a question back and say, what about pulling out the subsidies? So I think to me,
boost EVs.
No, I'm just imagining the scenario. Let's pull out all the subsidies and let's see what happens. And that'll be interesting.
Let's wait a few years before we do that.
So I feel it will be, an increasing availability of models. I think we need far, far more models. There are so many businesses right now betting on electric mobility, whether it's in last mile delivery or passenger mobility. I think they need solutions, vehicle solutions. Consumers, individual consumers, they are looking to buy vehicles for their own use that would meet the kind of requirements. I think, sorry, I have a power cut. Yeah, so it will
It's
be,
okay, as long as.
yeah. No, just to conclude, I think to me, enough consumer choices in the market is the next step. And two will be requiring a push to the industry through mechanisms like safe credit mandates that can help actually create these consumer choices by bringing more models to the market.
Sumit?
I think the next couple of years, coming from the investment side, the last few years, there have been certain early stage investments and certain large investments, the like of Ola deploying large capital or the larger deploying capital and early stage investments. There will be some startups that have been funded in the last 1 or 2 years that are going to go on to do a 10 million, $20 million check. And I think that is going to bring about a different kind of innovation, something that we've not looked at. The analogy that we give to when we talk to LPs or other people is the case of Tiger Global backing Flipkart with a $5 million check. It was unheard of what they did to the e-commerce sector. There are going to be some catalysts. A huge shout out to the team at RevoS and getting Union Square Ventures to invest in India for the first time, getting a $4 million check. It's a small check. We need a $10 million or $15 million check there. But anyways, it's getting started. I see a few startups which are going to get those larger checks because they're innovating for India within India specific solutions.
Right. So capital is the one thing, and that's something I want to hear too. Anand, what is the one thing that could give the boost to EV adoption? You're on mute.
No, I think, I would say financial innovation to help people buy. And second is what Akshaba said, consumer choices.
Yeah, financing is a big one, and thanks for adding that. Ashwin, last comments from you on what's the one thing that could, provide the required boost.
Yeah, well, I have two things, but one is an example of what Anand said. So we'll count that against him. The financing innovation that I would really like to see is long-term financing of vehicles. Right? Frankly, the vehicles are currently financed for 3 years and 4 years. If they're financed for 5 years and 6 years, you'll see 90% of what you need. The value capture from the low running cost will come much faster if you finance the vehicles over longer periods of time. So that's one thing that I would like to see on the financing. The other thing I think which is worth doing in the urban space is remove the distinction between what kind of vehicles can be used for commercial service and what kind of vehicles can be used for passenger transport. There is a lot of stuff that can be, interchangeably done with certain types of vehicles. To say that I can't deliver parcels in a car because a car is not really a licensed cargo delivery vehicle, those sorts of things need to go away. So we have to really start reimagining what these words mean in a shared economy. We have to share not only among users, we have to share time, but we also each have to share use cases. So if we can begin to share use cases, we'll get much faster acceleration of the shared economy.
Right. Can you still hear me? I think my video seems to be frozen for the last few seconds.
I still hear you. I wanted to say one thing on subsidies, which actually I had said.
Yeah.
As somebody who runs his company reasonably profitably without subsidy, I find subsidy is actually a penalty against me, that it encourages companies that can't do what we can do productively to compete with us by giving them a leg up. You could argue that I also need it, but I was doing better than them all along. Now you've made them profitable. So in a sense, I think subsidy is not well enough thought out. And I know I get a lot of flack from a lot of other people who are saying we don't want subsidies. But I think the government really need not give subsidies. I mean, Anand said this too. The unit economics is already there. What is the subsidy going to achieve? The subsidy is going to be captured by the people who can afford to buy these vehicles. They are not the bottom half of the population. If you're going to give subsidies, figure out how to give the subsidies to the user population. Give them free tickets if you like, and refinance, reimburse those. But why would you give subsidies to people who can buy cars?
We'll try the Akshima experience next time we meet. To see how once EV adoption is taken off and there are a few use cases happening, we'll try and pull out subsidy completely and see how that goes. Can you all still hear me? I think my video has been, cool. I think my video is just having some issues. But thank you. I think thanks for the closing comments, and it was a great panel discussion and a great discussion overall. And thanks Akshima, Ashwin, Anand, and Sumit for sharing your thoughts. I'm sure we can talk on a lot more things, but we'll probably take it offline. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Vasudha.
Thank you very much, Vasudha, for a brilliant moderation and enabling just brilliant thoughts on the table. All the panelists, thank you very much. This was indeed a very insightful discussion. And to wrap up, I would like to quote Anand, a fantastic mobility takeaway thought. If the ecosystem doesn't develop as a whole, we won't be able to move ahead.